Hello, this is Tommy Franks. Welcome to the 4-Star Leadership Podcast, product of the General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute and Museum. We're here to get a view into the lives of the legacy makers, the movers and the shakers of today. Offer insights from the full spectrum of the leadership community. We'll talk to former 4-star students and explore their leadership development path. We'll work to find out what they are about today and learn from the opportunities they've made for themselves in this world. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this podcast. Remember, leaders are not born, they're developed.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Core Principles of Leadership with General Tommy Franks. I'm your host, Dr. Jill Green, and we are on episode 32. Today, our guest, we have Shannon Huffman Polson. Shannon is the author of The Grit Factor, Courage, Resilience, and Leadership in the Most Male-Dominated Organization in the World, as well as her memoir, North of Hope. She is the founder of the Grit Institute, a leadership institute committed to the whole leader development, and host of the Grit Factor podcast. Polson also teaches on the faculty of the Tuck School's Leadership and Strategic Initiative Executive Education Program. She is one of the first women to fly the Apache helicopter in the United States Army, leading line units on 3 separate continents. Polson combines her passion and firsthand experience in and study of leadership, grit, purpose, and story to address the needs of her clients in the face of challenge and change with world-class keynotes and executive education. After serving for a decade in the armed services, Polson earned her MBA at the Tuck School at Dartmouth and later her MFA. She went on to lead outstanding teams in the corporate world, in the medical device industry, and at Microsoft. As a community leader, Polson successfully envisioned, founded, and led the completion of a $6.5 million new library and civic center. She has been featured on The Today Show, Newsweek, MarketWatch, The Financial Times, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, to just name a few. We'll be talking to Shannon about how to use your story to truly find your purpose, and then understanding and using your purpose, what she says is the bedrock to grit. Before we get started in our program, we'll have a word from one of our major sponsors, REI Oklahoma. REI Oklahoma is proud to be part of the General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute and Museum in the production and distribution of these podcasts designed to inspire leaders and difference makers. At REI Oklahoma, we have been working with small business leaders, entrepreneurs, and people who are driven to succeed for years. Highly motivated people working to own their own businesses, live in their own homes, and make the world a better place since its beginning. REI Oklahoma has continued to identify hurdles and deliver holistic solutions to create job growth and help neighborhoods thrive in both rural and urban communities. REI Oklahoma looks forward to visiting with you about helping your business and community grow. Visiting reiok.org or call 1-800-658-2823 to start the conversation.
The LaBar family is a 4th-generation Oklahoma family. That may not sound like a long time, but our grandfathers were born here, within the Comanche Nation, before the land grants. We are the proudest sponsor of the Tommy Franks 4-Star Leadership Podcast. We hope listeners will heed the words of these distinguished men and women who have served our country at the highest levels and across all walks of life.
Welcome, listeners. It's my pleasure to have with us today Shannon Huffman Polson. Shannon brings a wealth of knowledge on leadership, especially how to develop your grit and know when to use it. We're going to be speaking with her today on her book called The Grit Factor and how it coincides with our core principles of leadership at the General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute. I hope our listeners will be able to get some great inspiration from Shannon today. So let's go ahead and get started and jump right in with Shannon. When you committed to ROTC at Duke, how did your story up to that point in your life influence your decision?
Oh, Jill, it's so good to be here with you. The answer to that is probably a little bit windy, but I imagine that's true for most of us. I had grown up in Anchorage, Alaska. I was, for the first year and a half of my life, an Army brat to a JAG Corps officer. And so the concept of service was something that was very important in our family. We grew up going to church, making sandwiches and meals for people who didn't have enough and delivering those on Christmas Eve. And so that was the kind of thing that my family really prioritized. So I would say that concept of service was really important. The concept of service to country as well was important. My dad was really, really proud of his opportunity to serve. And so I think both of those were key factors in making the decision. I ultimately applied after I arrived at Duke. And so I had a 2-year guaranteed reserve forces duty scholarship. It was a guaranteed position with the National Guard. So I was drilling with the National Guard as well for 2 of those years. So it was a little bit different than going in with that ROTC scholarship. And I kind of had never thought of myself in that space, but it was really incredible when it opened up with just an amazing cohort of cadre and also really fantastic classmates as well.
So when you get through with your college and you've done all your training, I don't imagine you kind of went into the military thinking, I'm going to be one of the first female Apache pilots. I don't really, when I was reading, I didn't kind of take that as the goal.
No, definitely not. I mean, I had grown up in Alaska, aviation had always been an interest. There's a lot of small aviation, private aviation in Alaska because it's kind of one of the only ways to get around to a lot of the places, a lot of the state. But yeah, military aviation had not at all been what I thought that I would do. And so I would say that in some regards, when you sign up and you have a commitment, and I ended up, of course, going active duty instead of into the Guard. And I thought I wanted to do the coolest thing I could do, the most adventurous, the most exciting. And aviation definitely seemed like that thing. But at the same time, again, when you're 21 years old or 18 years old, when you sign up for the military, you rarely have any idea what it is that you're committing to.
Yeah. So in your book, you talk a lot about yourself, but you also interview some very influential pioneers, women in the military that did a lot of the first in, several different fields. And so in those, similar to you, they all had, they were the first, or among the first. And in that situation, I think what kind of sets you and those, females apart is, the adversity that you faced. There was probably a lot of challenges and, a lot of times that you probably just wanted to throw your hands up and say, enough is enough. So what was it in you that was similar with those other females that you talked about that, what was it inside of you that just kept you going?
Yeah, Jill, that's a great question. And I'm glad that you brought this up because I think just to back into a little bit into the Grit Factor, the book itself, it's the Grit Factor, Courage, Resilience, and Leadership in the most male-dominated organization in the world, right? And I think we'd all agree that the military certainly fits that bill, but there's many others that come fairly close. And I started to do the work on the Grit Factor when a young lieutenant reached out to me on an online officer mentorship program and asked if I would mentor her as she began the same journey that I had taken a number of years ago down at Fort Rucker. And which is now another name. Sorry, I know it is Fort Rucker. And I said, of course, but then I thought, gosh, it's been a while since, I was in uniform. I went through business school. I've been in the corporate world. And so how can I scale the information that I offer to this young leader? And if I do that work, then, which will be a lot of work, then how can I scale the people to whom this knowledge is available? And that was really the genesis of what became the Grit Factor. I was aware of having a particularly unique story in some regards. And so I wanted to bring in other stories as well to inform. So it wasn't just one person's perspective, it was many people's perspective. And then once I had many voices and I had dozens and dozens of leaders in the vanguards of their fields, then I could go back and do the secondary research and say, okay, now how does this make sense relative to the research? And then what kind of a framework can I offer to up and coming leaders, to transitioning leaders, to experienced leaders who are maybe re-examining how it is that they work in a very rapidly changing world. And what came out of that was the grit factor, which of course lines up with the grit triad. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But to back into your question again, that idea of bringing a cohort of exceptional leaders who all experienced what is called the double crucible. And that's a term that was coined by Deborah Rhodes, who's a Stanford law professor, late Stanford law professor, really facing the incredible demands of a job, in addition to sometimes facing the incredible demands of working in an environment which sometimes was actively resistant or at the very least was not always supportive. And so where did everybody get that grit? I think the $1 million question is grit innate or is it something that you develop? And I think the answer to that is usually both. Although, as you know from reading the book, we all came in with stories that were as varied as the people themselves, right? Some people came in through OCS, some through the academy, some through ROTC. And every one of them came in with very different backgrounds. Some were sporty, some were not sporty. One of them, my friend now, Karen Brash, called herself a Texas sorority girl. So all different types of people coming in to this incredibly intense environment. And I think what I would say to that is that all of us do have grit innate to each one of us, no matter who we are. It's not just military pilots and big mountain climbers. It's every single one of us. And when you're put in the position to find that grit, that's when you have the opportunity to really bring it out. At the same time, you can also develop grit. And that was one of the ideas behind the grit factor, is offering that to the leaders both in and out of the military today, whether they are a man or a woman.
So when you speak on grit, what exactly is it and how do you develop it?
It's a good question. So grit came out of every single conversation. It's the term that I grew up with up in Alaska with my dad, who pushed us very hard in everything that we did as well. And I have defined grit as a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances. It's the not very sexy stuff most of the time, right? And there's another very, very well-known researcher, Angela Duckworth, who has done research around grit as well, and she will call it passion and perseverance towards a long-term goal. And of course, that is also correct. She's the social scientist. But I think that doggedness and that determination sometimes is necessary when you don't always see that long-term goal. And we knew that in COVID when the horizons became very murky, right, and unclear. And so when I talk about grit to my clients, to big companies and organizations around the world now, we really look at it as that dogged determination, but it's not this discrete thing you pull off of the shelf, right, for mile 23 of the marathon, but it's very helpful there as well. We really think of grit as part of this holistic part of our character. And I use the grit triad to really frame that idea of a holistic concept where we have commit, learn, and launch aligned with owning our past, a deep engagement in the present, and then looking towards the future with that groundedness and with that engagement. And of course, in each one of those three pieces, we can go a lot deeper.
So you talk about the grit, it comes from your story. And, there's a lot of us who, have had a lot of adversity in our story and ups and downs, and a lot of it is just not very pretty.
Yes.
But when speaking of grit, it's how we handle those situations and we're learning from them. That's actually building our grit on how we're handling future events in our lives.
Absolutely, Jill. I think that is the first chapter of the grit factor, because that's part of that commit phase. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 are the absolutely critical core work that many of us don't take enough time to do. And it's necessary for every single one of us because we really are acting out of our sense of story. The neuroscience is really clear on this. All of the research is really clear on this. And the reality is as well, all of us have faced adversity at this stage in our lives. If you're as old as I am, and maybe you are, and actually, quite frankly, all of us after the last few years,
yes.
Right? And the question is, do you allow yourself to be a victim of that, or do you redefine? And it takes a lot of work, and you may in fact not have chosen the things that have happened. None of us would have chosen a lot of the events of the last 3 years, and most of us have other things as well that would qualify. So what do you do with that experience? That's the question. And I really think of it as both this opportunity, but also the responsibility to shape that raw material that we've been given into the direction that we want to go. And you can see examples of it all through the Grit Factor. I know General Franks certainly can share those stories, and many others as well, that it really is about taking that raw material, deciding how you're going to shape it, how you're going to use it to best contribute to the world, because that's what the world needs from each one of us.
Exactly. So I'm sure throughout your career, you've come across leaders who just really didn't have that grit. And so what is the difference and what separates, great leaders with grit from those that just don't have it?
Well, and the concept of leadership, of course, is more complex than just the idea of grit. And I know you know that, and you talk about this all the time. So I really think of the top three things that a leader has to do is to set a compelling and audacious vision. They've got to set that vision, and they've got to execute on it. And that execution is twofold. One of the biggest pieces of that is really the communication piece. And that's a back and forth thing. It's not just directive. It's back and forth, and it's relational. And then it's taking care of your people. So those are the pieces that really are what strategy execution is all about when it comes down to where the rubber hits the road or where the aircraft takes off on the tarmac. And so grit is certainly part of every piece of that. But alone, a person with grit isn't necessarily going to be a good leader. But for those leaders who have that triad of what's really, really important as a leader, having grit is, of course, a critical component. And I really think of grit and leadership as completely inseparable, because as a leader, you're often alone. You're often making hard decisions. You're often forced to choose things that may go against kind of what the popular sentiment is at the time. And that's just really, really hard stuff. And there's other times when you just have to push through. The difference in many cases is simply the choice. I mean, it's simply the choice to do that original work, to own and know your own story, to own and know your own personal purpose, and then connect that to the organizational purpose. And then to do the rest of the work that's around that communication piece, that relational piece, and that taking care of your people piece. And it is a choice. It's a choice that we make. I will also say that I have seen equally leaders make the mistake of thinking that grit is all about just gutting through, right? Just sucking it up and pushing through no matter what the cost. And the reality is that cost is great to both them and to all of the people who work for them. And unfortunately, I saw several examples of this when I was serving in the military. One of the things that I wish that I had written in the Grit Factor, and it certainly needs to be understood, is that grit is critical to leadership. It's critical to our execution. It's critical to our success. And yet, it is not a sustainable operating mode. It's not intended to be the average of how it is that you show up every day. And so while you need to develop and be able to employ grit, you also need to be able to rest. And you need to be able to ensure your people are developing their grit and that your people have an opportunity to rest. And so that balance is a really critical piece that a lot of leaders miss out on.
Very interesting. So when I was reading through, and you talk about caring quite a bit, and how important that is, and being a leader. And but at your first lieutenant pinning, you talked about your battalion commander and what his words that he spoke to you on that day. Can you kind of explain to us what he said that day and how it, has resonated with you?
Yeah, absolutely. This was then Lieutenant Colonel, and I believe he retired as a Major General, but John McDonald. And I am so grateful for his leadership when I was a lieutenant. I had really exceptional leadership both up and down. So my platoon sergeant was amazing. The battalion commander was amazing. And he really prioritized officer professional development and really, I think, worked to understand what it was that we needed to know and how it is that we needed to be able to do our work, and then supported that. But those are words that I share in nearly every keynote that I give, because they're just so critically important. And I both held them to be important, but also failed at times. And that's where I think my greatest failures were as well. And the words, I'm so glad that you asked this question because they're so important. And when he pinned on those silver bars of a first lieutenant, and your audience knows that that's sort of like your advanced learner's permit, right? Although you feel very important at the time. And it is very important, right? It is very important. But he said, the only good use of any increased power that you will ever have is the increased responsibility to take care of your people. And I always repeat that twice, right? The only good use of any increased power you will ever have as a leader is the increased responsibility to take care of your people. And I learned from him that leadership was a sacred trust. It's a sacred trust with the lives and the well-being of all of the people that are around you, not just the people that work directly for you. And that's true in and out of uniform. And I think that's one of the reasons that I was able to be successful moving on into the business world as well, was understanding that it's about taking care of your people first and foremost. Nothing else matters if you haven't done that one thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I was always taught that, the people are your most treasured asset, no matter what. So in General Franks, in his book, he kind of talks about a caring leader when even clear back when he was in Vietnam, they had come under ambush and it was, really chaotic. And he had heard his lieutenant or commander, one above him, use a call sign to call in for air support, and it wasn't coming. And so he felt like there would be no out. So he used his commander's call sign. And so once, the air support came in and, here comes, the lead commander and the generals and their, Jeeps and Humvees, and wanted to know who authorized that. And, he just knew that he was going to get courted off and court-martialed, and, but his commander stepped up and said, I gave him permission. I did that.
Yes.
And he talks about that. That was really the first time he understood what it meant for, a leader to care about, their people. And he was like, it could have ended my career then, and,
Sure.
just made history go in a different direction. But it was because he had a caring commander that stepped up and, took the discipline that was really duly his.
Yes.
So
that's it's such a great story and such a great example. And I will say the greatest joys that I have had at various points, leading teams in and out of uniform, was the opportunity to take care of people in a way that was both unexpected and maybe even outside of the regulations, right? But making it work, because it was about taking care of people and doing the right thing. And those are by far the most important things that I was able to do. And, I later heard from someone actually at Microsoft, and there was a contractor that was working for us. And so she was given very little time off, but she ended up having some really scary health stuff happening. And I ended up letting her go many more times than the contract would have allowed to various appointments. And the young woman who was working for me, for whom she was attached or assigned, reached out and said, that literally saved her life, because you gave her that extra time. She would have had to quit her job, which she was not able to do, and be able to still make ends meet. And because she was under contract and able to go to these appointments, it literally identified a cancer, was able to then take care. And so, we have this chance to literally in and out of uniform make a difference of life and death, and certainly a life of meaning for everybody around us. And that's such an incredible honor, and one not to be taken lightly.
Exactly. So with that, can you think of two examples, in your life where you had a caring, compassionate leader, and what that experience meant to you?
Yes. Well, and I'm going to give one that's out of uniform. I think you likely have listeners.
Most certainly, yes.
In and out of uniform, yeah. This is a particularly amazing example and a slightly difficult story to tell. But my first book is not The Grit Factor. My first book is called North of Hope, A Daughter's Arctic Journey. And it follows a trip that I took a year after my father and stepmother were killed in Arctic Alaska by a grizzly bear. And I went up and followed their same trip up along the same river up in the northeast corner of Arctic Alaska. And so to back up from that, I was working at Microsoft at the time. I'd been working there for about 6 months. This was a couple of years out of business school. And I was working in finance, which is absolutely not the right fit for me. I find I'm, but I was doing a pretty good job, but I wasn't exceptional. And I had a boss who was a director at the time, and he was from Spain. He was from France, but had lived in Spain. Anyway, but he was very close to his father. And so he had a chance to meet my father when he had come through Redmond, Washington to visit. And so I was down in Portland with my brother on a June morning when I had the phone call that told me that my father and stepmother had been killed. And as I was driving north to Seattle, I called my boss and let him know I wasn't coming to work on Monday. And he said, listen, if you need a week and then you want to come back to work, that's great. He said, if you need 3 months, then great. You do whatever you need and take any time you want. You have a blank check and your job is waiting for you when you get back. And there's no policy for that, right? There was no policy for that. He had to call up to the VP and have that approved and all that. But it was something where I had both members of a household had died. And so I had to help to clear out the house, and I had to manage the funeral, and I had to then sell the house and do all of those things that unfortunately probably people in your audience have also had to do. And it's a really hard task. And so I wasn't back to work for 2 to 3 months. And when I did come back to work, the general manager, to whom my director reported 2 levels up, had realized that finance wasn't the right really place for me to contribute my best to Microsoft. And so put me in another position, which was leading a team and an international project, this great opportunity to really lead and to craft something of value, which was a much better fit for who I was and how I could contribute. And both of those pieces, both the reaction that said, you take whatever time you need, and this job will be here when you get back. He actually took me out to dinner in Bellevue before I headed up to Alaska. And the idea that understanding that, hey, you know what, this isn't the best place for her to really excel. So let's give her an opportunity to really, really hit it out of the park. Both of those pieces were acts of incredible kindness at an unbelievably difficult time. And I haven't heard of that many examples like that, but I'm unbelievably grateful that, and really very blessed that I was working for the person that I was working. His name was Mark Regera. And I'm so grateful for Mark's leadership and his willingness to take a risk.
That is amazing because, if you think about it, Microsoft has hundreds of thousands of applicants that, you could have been so easily just replaced and absolutely. They would have just, moved on with their daily, work.
Exactly.
So that is amazing.
It was pretty spectacular. And again, both at Microsoft and in the military, it was not as nearly as dramatic as what Mark was able to do for me. But I was grateful when I had a chance to, support a young soldier whose grandmother had died, and our regulations didn't actually permit someone to leave internationally because we were in Korea to visit his grandmother. And both, my warrant officers, my soldiers, our whole company really supported rallying around, finding a way to get him to the airport, to get him back to the States. And because that was who he had grown up with, but the regulations didn't understand that, right? And so it's just times when you have to do what's right. And what's right isn't always the regulations, but there's a little bit of making sure that you take care of things that so nobody gets in trouble, but it's also just taking care of people. And it turns out that when you take care of people, they take care of the mission. And that's just how it works.
Yeah. So we had an individual in the museum yesterday, and we have a Medal of Honor display, and he was talking about, what courageous acts, have to come about to receive a Medal of Honor. And they were like, because they were talking, and many of those acts are way against regulation. Like they would never expect, any individual to do the things that some of our soldiers do out on the battlefield. And he was like, it's just those people that go above and beyond to help other people. And those are the kind of people that get the Medal of Honor. They're the ones that are brave enough to go against the grain.
Yes.
And it really is.
Yes. It's important. A plan is something you deviate from, right? And Plans don't survive first
Exactly.
contact, all those things that all of us know. But you do have to start with it. And then you say, hey, what is the right thing to do here? And the right thing to do occasionally means coloring outside of the lines. Actually, maybe even often does.
Let's pause for just a moment for a word from one of our generous sponsors. Hello, this is Dr. Jill Green with the General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute and Museum. I would like to tell you about one of our partner sponsors, Justin Krieger. He has worked as an independent insurance agent at Krieger Insurance Agency in his hometown of Hobart, Oklahoma since 1999. Justin is honored to help with our annual Celebration of Freedom event and has served on the board of directors for the General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute and Museum for many years. He is a fifth-generation farmer and rancher in Kiowa County, where cattle, crops, and even insurance is sold with a handshake. Give him a call at 580-726-3076 or come by the office and speak with Justin or Kathy Langford about your insurance needs. Krieger Insurance is thankful for their loyal customers and friends who have supported them through the years and look forward to earning your business as well. Justin feels honored to live in such a great country, and he is proud to be a sponsor of the Core Principles of Leadership podcasts. Please enjoy the rest of this podcast experience brought to you by your friends at Krieger Insurance Agency. Now let's get back to this great episode. Yeah, so another principle that you talked about in your book is listening. And that matches up with one of our core principles in our communication aspect of leading.
Yes.
And so at our last 4-star, we had Eric Maddox speak to our students, and he is an Army interrogator that has been credited with getting the intelligence that was able to find and capture Saddam Hussein.
Yes.
So he was amazing to speak with, and our students were so impressed with him, but he changed the way that our students really thought about listening. So
Yes.
He explained that he was green. He'd never, interrogated a detainee before. And, he just kind of, you learn so much in training, but then, you get into the real world and it's never quite the same of what you've learned. So
Yes.
he just kind of went with what he knew. And all the interrogators before him were like, you're never going to be able to crack this person. And, and so he would just go in and he left all his bias about these are mean, hateful people. He left that all at the door, and he just went in and he listened. He listened to their stories. He listened to them talk about their parents. And little by little, they began to trust him. And then they began to open up, and it was really interesting. But you go further. Once you say you listen, once you ask your question, you're going to listen, but then you pause.
Yes.
Why is that pause so important?
Oh gosh. And it's so hard and it's so important. Yeah. So you ask, you listen, and you pause, right? That's the framework for active listening. And I will just say it's something that I'm going to be working on my whole life. It's not something I do well, or many of us who are so execution oriented do well. But it is something that the importance of listening, and this was so surprising to me when I was doing the research for the Grit Factor, it wouldn't have come up if I had just written my own story because I wasn't smart enough to recognize it. But in interviewing these other leaders, general officers from across the services, aviators from World War II to the present, and many, many more, every senior leader brought listening up as one of the most strategic and important leadership skills. And so I learned a lot from this process myself. But the ask, the listen, and the pause, which can be anywhere from, 10 seconds to 10 hours to 10 days, really depending on how difficult it is that you're hearing. If you're hearing something that's really difficult feedback for you or really unexpected, what you don't want to do, and most of us do this just naturally, is to rush to judgment on what's just been said, what the person has just said. You don't want to rush to an answer or to a solution, which is what many of us do, again, who have been in operations or been in charge of things. So that pause allows you to really let that information kind of percolate a little bit, kind of soak in. And again, just like you were explaining that the interrogator put his judgment at the door, you've got to kind of put your judgment aside, that natural tendency to react immediately, and really consider it in the light of other information that you might have, in the light of maybe the shared goals that you have. And it really, oftentimes, if it's difficult enough to hear, you may say, thanks for sharing that. I hadn't expected to hear that. And I'd love to think about that for a while and then circle back with you. And then make absolutely certain that you do, because there's a lot of studies around this. And when you say that and you don't circle back, the results are very poor. But when you do circle back and say, I've been thinking about this, and then start to have that conversation and ask questions and ask follow-up questions, there's an incredible richness of communication that happens, number one. But number two, there may be solutions that you're able to reach by having suspended judgment in the first place. And so that pause, again, can be relatively short, but it should typically be longer than you're comfortable with, just to be absolutely sure that you are moving past that point of immediate reaction to a place of careful consideration.
Mm-hmm. That's just so, I think that's, if we could all learn to really pause, I think that would, there's just so many rash and harsh judgments, and, you always hear people say, I did that in the, just a reaction. And,
yes.
And I was explaining to the students at 4-Star, I'm really bad about saying something and then being like, oh, that didn't come out the way I wanted it to sound.
Yes.
So that pause is something I need to practice as well.
Well, having teenagers at home, I will tell you, I struggle with this daily.
So our 4-Star students, we have a mixture of high school students that are in junior ROTC, and then we have students that are just great leaders within their community and their schools that really have no connection to the military. So our young leaders who don't have a connection to the military and a military background, military members, they're successful and because they're resilient. They have to really know how to, they have to learn to be optimistic, because a lot of times in their work, it's very, it's grave and dangerous. And so they have to be able to be optimistic and, learn to control the variables that are controllable. Don't linger on those ones that, there's certain aspects in the world that you just have no control over.
Yes.
So you can't linger on that. So, but the military, and you talk about the battle mind. Mm-hmm. So to civilians, what does that mean and why is it important?
Yeah, it's, this falls within the constructs of the mindset piece of what it is that we're considering. And in the grit triad, again, that commit phase is owning your past, right? That's your story and your purpose. That next phase is learn, and that's building your team, that's active listening, and then it's mindset. And, I've been doing a lot more work in mindset even since the book has been published, because there's a lot of really important things to both learn and put into practice. But one of them that we do talk about in the book is, and this relates to the question at hand as well, is this idea of measured optimism. And, the Stockdale paradox is one that many of your listeners will be familiar with, but this is Admiral Stockdale flying low over the trees, shot down in Vietnam in Hanoi Hilton for 7.5 years. He had his legs broken several times. He was tortured, almost a dozen times. He was in solitary confinement for half of that time. And when they released him, they said, what's the difference? What's the difference between those who lived and those who died? And he said, well, it's easy. The optimists died. Now we're going to follow up on this in just a moment. He said the optimists, and by optimists, what he meant were what we would now call a Pollyanna, right? Somebody who says, oh, well, surely we'll be released by Easter, and Easter comes and goes and nothing changes, and then they die of a broken heart. Or surely the war will be over by September, and September comes and goes and they die of a broken heart. And he said, here's the lesson. And this is what measured optimism is all about. And this is a circle that surrounds the grit triad, right? That surrounds that commit, learn, and launch. That circle that surrounds it says that you can never, ever lose faith, that you will ultimately prevail in the end, grounded or balanced with the brutal realities of what you face in the present. So it's not being a Pollyanna. It's not pretending that the challenges don't exist, but it is being absolutely certain that you will meet the objective. You may not know the exact way you'll meet the objective. You may in fact have to, and in fact you'll likely have to change course at one or more times, but you're absolutely determined that you will ultimately get there. And that is the mindset of measured optimism. I would say grounded optimism, but aviators don't like the word grounded. So, so it's really about that measured optimism. And that's something that every one of us has to have. It's critical to even move forward into the grit triad itself. Before you start to redefine your story, you've got to define it with that kind of a mindset that says, I am going to succeed. Now, how do I take this raw material of my life and shape it so that I will succeed, so I can contribute my absolute best self for a better world, right? And that is, you must go into that with that mindset. And the best thing about that mindset, it's a choice. It's not something you're born with. It's not something that's given to you. It's something that you choose each and every single day. And that power of agency is an incredible thing, really an incredible thing. And I think it's something that we need to emphasize more and more, because every one of us has the opportunity to make that choice every day. And when things are tough, every hour and every moment of those same days.
Yeah, I mean, and I would think that, once you, really find out how to grasp that, it's got to be, resonating and just, life altering. So, and then being resilient with that, and this kind of follows up, is you talk about being able to self-regulate. So what exactly does that mean?
Wow. And this is also hard, right? This goes back to, in part, the not reacting but not just not reacting to what you hear, just not simply reacting to what happens. And there is this quote that's often attributed to Viktor Frankl. I think we're not entirely sure where it actually originated, although that's a great source to give attribution in many ways, which is that there's a space between stimulus and response, right? And our opportunity is to decide what we're going to do in that space between that stimulus, that thing that happens, and our response to it. And that response could be something that affects us internally, or it could be something that we do externally. And so that self-regulation are the various practices that we can put into place, and there are many of them. And most of them are relatively simple if they're practiced with intention and they're done consistently, that can help us with that self-regulation. So some of the things that we talk about are gratitude journaling, right? And I almost laugh when I say this, like you probably have seen this on the cover of Oprah, but it doesn't matter. It's that important. And it's that effective for every one of us to get up every morning. And you'll talk to now CEOs and all these guys that, have these, Vet Bro podcasts, whatever they are. They're writing down the things that they're grateful for every single day. So you wake up and you say, what are the 3 things I'm most grateful for right now, and why? You could just take 3 minutes, right? And write it down. And then before you go to bed, say, what are the 3 things I'm most grateful for? And write it down. So that's one thing. Another thing are breathing exercises. There's a lot of good that can be done with breathing exercises. And it's literally regulating our physiology. So it's both mental and physical. And as anybody who's been in this space for more than a minute knows, our mental well-being and our physical well-being is absolutely linked. And so when we regulate ourselves physiologically, we are also regulating ourselves, or learning to regulate ourselves emotionally and mentally. And so there's several different breathing exercises that we go through in part in the Grit Factor as well. And some of those will be known by those who have gone through the Army's Master Resilience Training Program too. So there's a number of different ways. Spiritual practice, however it is that you define that, is also something that helps to support self-regulation. And so all of those are things that are really, we each have agency to decide to take them on. But we also have that responsibility to decide to take them on. And it is an important part of being in this world today, I think.
Yeah. So in the last part of the resilience that you're speaking of in the book, and you portrayed it, as did all those amazing women that you spoke about in the book, and it was staying focused over the long term. So, in our world that we're just so used to instant gratification. We want things now. And if it doesn't happen, then we throw up our hands and we just forget that one. We're going to move on to the next.
Yes.
So how is that, how do you define and really learn, to stay the course?
Yeah, this goes back to agency as well, but it's something that you have to you really have to be aware of and tune yourself to that awareness. I would recommend the work of Cal Newport in this particular area. He does really excellent work around that, especially because you have some young people there, and there's so many distractions. In our family, and this may not be something that everyone's comfortable with, but our children don't have cell phones because the science on it is really clear. They're too distracting for a young mind, and our frontal cortex is not completely formed, frontal lobe, until we're 25 years old. And so we're just simply not equipped. I mean, even adults are not equipped to deal with the distraction of what a cell phone offers. They also don't have social media accounts, right? And you can decide how it is you're going to engage with that. And I think for many of us who are adults, we have to make that decision on how we engage with these many distractions in a way that allows us to keep doing really important work. So for me, that's meant winnowing down that time significantly that I spend, making sure there's still some engagement, but that it's limited, time limited and time scheduled as well. So it's really, I think, putting some practices into place that allow us to focus, understanding that the world is not set up to support your focus. The world is competing for your attention. It's part of our capitalist, economy. It's part of how technology works. But you contributing your best self requires you to be able to focus. And so I would strongly recommend for anybody who is doing this work, read Cal Newport's book called Deep Work. Put those parameters in place that limit your ability to be distracted by technology. While we're on this podcast, for example, I have my computer turned to do not disturb. Well, you can have your computer turned to do not disturb most of the time, right? Unless you have an hour where you're going to spend doing emails and doing some other things, but you block that hour so you're not just on there constantly responding to things. Because Cal Newport explains the research shows that once your brain pops up out of that deep work, you can't just get back down there. It's not something you can pop in and out of. And so he speaks actually to high school students as well who are preparing for college as well as the rest of us. And he says, listen, you've got to set those parameters on how it is that you allow yourself to be interrupted. I'll say as a parent, it's very difficult because your kids
yes
that are not expected. Don't know what to say about that. But you do have to block that time and manage those interruptions. And if you don't do it, it's almost impossible to stay focused.
So in part of resilience, and we try to, let our young leaders know that they're going to come up against leaders or team members that maybe don't have the same, values or focus that they do. And it can be very lonely when you're in that situation. So how do you recommend when students are in that kind of situation? How do they, find their resilience to, keep going?
Such a good question, because that happens all the time. And relationships are where the most difficult things happen, for sure. It's not in the execution of strategy or the operations, right? That gets hard and gnarly sometimes, but not nearly as difficult as relationships. Yeah, I would say I would start with going back to the second part of the commit phase. And that second part is a really deep dive into purpose. I actually have this as part of both my Going for Grit course at the Grit Institute, but also an entire course that blows it out into paths to purpose, because it's that important. And when you reconnect in difficult times, whatever is causing those difficult times, to your purpose, that gives you increased ability to focus and increased ability to perform and increased ability to do what needs to be done to stay on track. So connecting to purpose is the first thing. The second thing is I'd suggest to folks to decide, and again, this goes back to agency and a decision, and this is hard to do because, gosh, it's just hard in the moment, and it's hard if there's difficult people around you, to try to adopt a curious mind. Say, I wonder why this person is like this. Or if I can't change this person, because most of us can't change people, right? You say, what could I learn from this person that I don't want to do? I've heard from many people about how they have been de-mentored, right? So they've worked for somebody who was a terrible leader, and they say, what do I learn from this person that I don't want to do, right? That I want to make sure I don't do? Or how can I learn from this poor leadership to become a better leader in another way, to amplify something that I'm working on? And so take that posture of curiosity and ask yourself the question, how can this challenging thing make me better? And I think both of those are great opportunities to start to move past a frustrating situation, and know too that it's just part of it, right? It's part of the experience. You're not going to have the best battalion commander and the best platoon sergeant all the time. I had the worst platoon sergeant after I had the best platoon sergeant, right? I mean, that happens. Luckily, I was trained by the best. And so, but then you work within that, and it's tough, but you take the posture of curiosity, then you make the decisions about what needs to happen, and move forward. So, but keep yourself focused on the goal and focused on your purpose, and that will help keep you on track.
Well, in that purpose, when you really dig deep, that's really what your grit is coming from, is your purpose. And in those difficult times is when your grit really comes to the forefront and helps you through. Just like you said at the beginning, your grit is not always on display. It's, when you're down in the trenches and at your lowest is, really when you really need to dig deep and, use your grit to come out on the other side.
Yes. So. And at the same time, I would say, don't allow grit to substitute for necessary action. So if there's a conversation that you need to have, you don't put it aside just because you're saying, well, I'm being gritty. Or if you're being treated very badly or abused, there's never an excuse for that. You're not supposed to just deal with that. You're supposed to get help and get outside of those situations. So there are exceptions to this for sure. I think that just takes a thoughtful, careful perspective, and ideally some help from a mentor as well if things are really difficult.
Yeah. So, and you talk about the importance of, a mentor in your circle, and, having that circle that is there to be supportive and, have your back. That's really important when you're, young, is, deciding who is going to be in your circle.
Yes.
And, connecting your circle with your values.
Yes.
And so I think that that's really important. So,
beautiful.
So you talk about the importance of being yourself. So, and I think that is so important in today's time. You talked about, social media before, and, we always laugh about, there's Facebook Jill, and then there's the real Jill, and, things like that. And everyone tries to portray themselves as, happier or, prettier or thinner or, more successful than they really are.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, you're never going to be as happy as you are until you really come to the gut reality. I am who I am, and this is me. So, and you talk about the importance of that.
Yes. Yeah. It's something that I realized later that I didn't do well when I was in the military. So as one of the first women to fly the Apache, right, I came into 120 male combat pilots in the 229th Attack Aviation Regiment, and I had my hair cut super short, and I was like, I'm going to give them nothing that they can complain about, right? So I made sure I was exceptional. I could max the PT test. I could, that I was good, that they weren't going to be able to say, oh my gosh, you can't even do a push-up or whatever it might be said. I didn't know, but I knew that things were going to be said. And I think I also took on a persona in a sense that I thought was necessary to be successful. And then I was successful with that persona. And at the end of my time on active duty, I felt like I had to be this person that was not necessarily aligned with who I really was. And that was one of the reasons that I chose to leave the military, is I felt like that's what was necessary. And by the way, that was my perception in my circumstance. I'm not saying that that's what anyone else told me. It's just that I was able to be a certain way, which was, like you'd expect in combat aviation. And I got great feedback for it. So I was like, all right, I'm being successful, but I'm not feeling like I'm being true to who I am. And in every way that was important to me. And so So I think it's important for leaders to know now. And I also think it's very different now, right? It's been, 30 years. And so, well, not quite 30 years, but 30 years since I started, since I began the journey. And so things have changed. I think we have a better understanding now that there are different types of leadership that are very valuable and in fact important for us to be able to accomplish the mission in uniform or out of uniform. But if you are in a place, and there still are many places where that isn't as open a conversation, it's important to feel confident that you're bringing your best to the table when you're authentically yourself. And that's absolutely the case. This does not mean, and I'll make a caveat for the young people here too, this does not mean that you get to walk in with purple hair to JP Morgan, right? I mean, you still have to fit within the culture of the organization, or you
right, the standards. Exactly.
Right, there's standards, and that's you're not better than those standards. You join an organization and support it. But join one that's aligned with your values and that allows you to be the person that you are, because that's the only way to contribute your absolute best self. And it's a fine, hard line to walk sometimes, especially for minorities in this environment. But an important one for you to be able to be your best and contribute your best. And that's what we all need, is for us to contribute our best selves for a better world.
Yeah. So, and that's what we try to teach our students, go in and do something that you truly enjoy. Don't find something because it pays a lot of money and you hate going to work every day. Your life will be mundane and it will just create chaos. Find your purpose, just like you say, and, go out and do something good with it. And so, and you talk about that as you close your book, we have to, find our purpose and use it for good. And that's what, exactly what we teach our students is, we're going out and we want to find the answers to the problems and, be the exception to the people that are going out and, complaining about something, but not doing anything about it.
Yes.
So,
yes. And make sure that whatever you do meets the criteria of first, do no harm, because there are people that will lead you along what they call a purposeful track. But if it is ever doing violence to any other human or that's wrong. And so I think that's a helpful thing to say, hey, find your purpose and make sure that it meets that criteria so that it is doing good in the world without doing harm. And that's important. An important thing.
Yeah, so we have a student, and he was in our most recent class, and he had come from Arizona, and he had been invited to speak at the UN for a nonprofit that he had started, and he's like 17 years old, and he's very tech smart, and so he had been somewhere and saw a need for children with special needs, that they weren't able to drive the little Power Wheels vehicles. And so he was able to rewire and refigure them to where they had hand controls instead of feet controls. And so now his nonprofit, he's 17 years old. His nonprofit goes around and they redo these Power Wheels and, put them into children's hospitals and, that sort of thing. But it's just that power, using your talents and your good to make something better for someone else. And so these kids that we work with, they're just amazing. And so that's, really what we're wanting to, General Franks talks to them, and he talks about, 9/11 and when everything finally calmed down after that day and everyone was able to take a breath. He talked to Donald Rumsfeld, and he told him, we know exactly that it was the Taliban. We know this. And Donald Rumsfeld asked him, what are you going to do about it? And he, informed him what we're going to do about it. But that's how he closes with our students, is what are you going to do about it? And so we're trying to, create leaders that are willing to go out and, make this world a better place. And I think that those kind of leaders that go out into those uncharted territories really need the grit
Yes.
and that you're talking about. So I'm so glad that we were able to have this conversation today and learn more about grit and how we get it. But I always like to close with our podcast guests with the same question. So with the knowledge and life experience that you've had now, what is the one piece of advice that you would give 18-year-old Shannon?
You'd think that I would have been asked this before. I which I don't know that I have been, although I think it's a great question. I would say to move back to just maybe two things. I mean, I guess I would reiterate the importance of being comfortable being yourself, and that yourself is not only enough, but is needed in the world to be able to do things that need to be done. That's important. And it's important to honor that, because that's how you show up to be your best and to do your best and contribute your best self. And I would also say, and I'm going to just add this in because I think this is so important for some of your audience as well, is that if you have served in uniform and you're transitioning out to be out of uniform, or at some point you expect to serve in uniform, and then at some point, of course, you'll be a civilian afterwards as well, know that you serve in many different ways. And it sounds like your student cohort knows this with that example that you just gave of that wonderful student at the UN and his nonprofit. But there are many ways that the world needs us to show up to make things better. And there will be resistance to change. There is always resistance to change. Even when my most recent project, I worked for 6 years to build a new community library in our small town. And I figured nobody opposes a library. I mean, this is in a rural area, and you get people that come out of the woodwork that you wouldn't believe. And so there's always going to be resistance to change, but you stay focused on your purpose. Know that you're making a difference. Know that you can make a difference in uniform and out of uniform, and look for those opportunities and trust the journey. I guess that's the end of that is just trust the journey.
Trust the journey. That's great words of wisdom. So, and when you talk about being out of uniform, my husband, he was medically retired. And so, I mean, that takes a lot of, they've worn the uniform for so long. It takes a lot of effort and time to understand that, you have other purposes in your life now, and you can use your story that that has made you who you are to define that new purpose in your life. So I really appreciate your time today. And this was a great discussion. And I know our listeners are going to love it. And again, if you don't have her book, The Grit Factor, I encourage everyone to go out and get it. I read it in 2 days, and it was really amazing. And I think I tabbed and highlighted at least half of it. So
fabulous.
Yes. So I have learned a lot through it, and there's a lot that I'm going to share with our students and our future students. Thank you again to REI Oklahoma for making this podcast possible. For nearly 40 years, the board, staff, patrons, and supporters of the nonprofit economic development REI Oklahoma have been committed to expanding Oklahoma's economic prosperity, earning the reputation of being one of the most comprehensive economic development organizations in the country. Business lines, training workshops, business consulting, and networking opportunities, as well as technical assistance and even commercial business space, are made available to Oklahoma entrepreneurs and small businesses. For low and moderate income individuals and families, down payment and or closing cost assistance is offered. Learn more at reiok.org. On behalf of the 4-Star Leadership with General Tommy Franks team, I'm your host, Dr. Jill Green, and this has been the Core Principles of Leadership with General Tommy Franks podcast. Now it's your turn, podcast listeners. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and let us know what you think of this episode and all our other episodes. Share this podcast with all the leaders and up-and-coming leaders in your circles. Be sure to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast listening platform, and don't forget to mark your calendars the last Friday of each month for another inspiring episode. So for now, as General Franks always says, go be feisty.